The 1920s was a transformative decade in America. Dubbed the Roaring Twenties for the economic and social growth that defined it, the 20s were characterized by a conflict between traditionalism and modernity, which manifested in the cultural trends of the day. Traditionalism is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as the adherence to the doctrines or practices of a tradition. In the 1920s, this meant a resistance to the societal evolution and the principles of modernity, in favor of maintaining the status quo and American way of life that existed prior. Modernists of the decade, on the other hand, embraced the new norms of life in the 20s and actively pursued progress and change. The tension between the two groups was unavoidable, embedding itself in all aspects of life in the 1920s. The struggle between traditionalism and modernity in the 1920s was particularly evident in the rise of consumer culture, the clash between scientific progress and religious belief, and the changing role of women, who, despite gaining new freedoms, faced significant pushback, as seen in the Hays Code's restriction of women's rights, freedoms, and roles in cinema.
The 1920s marked the beginning of mass consumerism in America. Mass production made goods more affordable than ever. Suddenly, products that once required the touch of a skilled laborer could be churned out by the hundreds in a factory. The Model T, radio, and refrigerators were no longer luxury items, but within the grasp of working-class families. Companies quickly realized that advertisements could attract masses of workers to their products. Ads for every type of good appeared in newspapers, magazines, and radio shows. Ford, for example, launched an advertising campaign for its Model T, featuring the gleaming car with a classy woman beside it. If the economic prosperity of the 1920s set the stage for consumerism, credit was the reason for its explosion. Advertisements attracted customers, but credit gave them the confidence to make purchases. For nearly any product, companies offered a credit system, allowing working-class people to live above their means. Credit fueled the consumerist culture of spending and of debt, a far cry from the conservative spending habits of generations prior. For traditionalists, the explosion of consumer culture was troubling. They saw it as a shift away from modesty, self-sufficiency, and conservatism. The emphasis on mass production and credit represented a new economic reality, one where consumption, rather than saving, drove the American economy. Traditionalists typically opposed the extravagant spending habits consumerism celebrated. The Grange, an organization supporting farmers and other working-class individuals, used advertising to combat consumerism by promoting self-sufficiency and financial restraint. Modernists, however, embraced the economic trend and the access to goods it afforded workers. Consumerism represented to many modernists freedom and opportunity for the average American. One of the most iconic events of the 1920s, the Scopes trial, perfectly represented the tension between science and religion at the time, and the conflict between modernity and traditionalism. In the 1920s, the religious landscape of the U.S. was dominated by Protestant Christianity. Generally, this meant following a strict interpretation of the Bible and its teachings, leaving little room for theories conflicting with the Bible. At the same time, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was gaining legitimacy and popularity in the scientific community. Although not yet completely accepted, proponents of the theory argued for its widespread adoption. In some cases, practitioners of all faiths loosened their religious interpretations such that the scientific progress could coincide with the religion, leaving room for evolution and other research. In Tennessee High School, teacher John Scopes was put on trial for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, which contradicted the Bible account of creation. The trial was indicative of the clash between the modern scientific view and traditional religious beliefs. The trial was quickly popularized, pitting Clarence Darrow, who argued for the right to teach scientific truth, against William Jennings Bryan, a proponent of Protestantism and literal biblical interpretation. Darrow's defense was clear. Science should not be constrained by religion. But for many traditionalists, accepting Darwin's theory was not only a threat to religious faith, but to the morality of society.
No social change of the 1920s was as visible as the transformation of women's roles. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, women gained the right to vote. When young men were sent overseas to join World War I, it was women who took their place in the workforce. As the decade progressed, women broke free of traditional roles, entered the workforce, and embraced a new, more liberated lifestyle. Flappers, young women who rejected the traditional constraints of femininity, became the iconic symbol of this new era. They drank, smoked, danced, and wore short dresses, challenging long-held norms of what it meant to be a woman in America. For modernists, the flapper represented the future, a woman who was independent, confident, and unafraid to challenge societal expectations. But for many traditionalists, the flapper was a threat. She symbolized the collapse of morality, the destruction of family values, and the breakdown of social norms. The backlash against the flapper was great. The Hays Code, introduced in 1930, reflected the resistance to the changing role of women. This set of moral guidelines imposed censorship on Hollywood films, targeting how women were depicted. The code prohibited the portrayal of women suggestively and demanded female characters be shown in traditional maternal roles. While the rights and freedoms of women were advanced in the 1920s, the fight for equality was nowhere near finished. Women continue to fight for fair treatment in today's society. In the 20s, many women were pushed back into domestic life and out of the workplace. The Hays Code was not just a product of Hollywood's need to clean up its image. It was a direct response to the freedoms women had begun to enjoy. By policing female representation in film, traditionalists aimed to reinforce the idea that women should be confined to the homestead, and that any deviation from this role was immoral.
The struggles of the 1920s, consumerism, the fight between science and religion, and the changing role of women continue to echo in society today. In recent years, debates over women's rights, particularly reproductive freedom, have once again brought issues of gender inequality to the forefront. In 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending a nearly 50-year-old precedent protecting a woman's right to an abortion. The decision gave states the right to choose whether abortion would be allowed, declaring it unconstitutional for the government to mandate a woman's right to choose. The political discourse surrounding Roe v. Wade and abortion rights are glaringly reminiscent of the battle between traditionalists and modernists over issues like women's rights, religion, and consumerism. For traditionalists, the overturning of Roe v. Wade was seen as a victory. Many conservatives viewed abortion as a moral issue, a matter of preserving life, upholding religious values, and protecting the traditional family unit. For them, laws that permitted abortion challenged their understanding of family and moral responsibility. Much like the opposition to flappers in the 1920s, this was a direct attack on what they saw as traditional values. For modernists, the overturning of Roe v. Wade was a setback in the struggle for gender equality and autonomy. Much like the flappers of the 1920s, who challenged traditional societal notions, modern women today are fighting for the right to make their own choices. The right to an abortion is not just about reproductive health, it's about women's control over their bodies and the ability to make decisions that impact them, much like how women's suffrage in the 1920s was about expanding political and social rights. Just as flappers in the 1920s were considered immoral for rejecting traditional gender roles, today's women who advocate for reproductive rights are often accused of opposing family values or challenging moral standards. The resistance to abortion access mirrors the way traditionalists in the 1920s resisted changing rules, framing those changes as dangerous established social norms.
The conflict between traditionalism and modernity has been a defining force throughout American history, and the 1920s serve as a prime example of how this tension played out in various aspects of American life. During this time, shifting gender roles, the rise of consumerism, and the debate over science versus religion were all the result of this conflict. From the changing roles of women, shown by the flapper and new legal rights, to the debate over evolution in the Scopes trial, to the emergence of a consumer-driven economy, the 1920s were a time of transformation and resistance to change. The Hays Code, which was introduced to regulate women's portrayals in cinema, is just one example of the tension between changing social norms and traditional values. Today, the overturning of Roe v. Wade has sparked similar debates over the rights of individuals. The political discourse surrounding the issue echoes many of the same themes seen in the 1920s. The tension between evolving individual rights and traditional values, and the challenge of balancing progress with maintaining social norms.